Welcome back to the kitchen at Andersen Acres. Today we're just going to talk a little bit about some of the little tips and tricks when you're making yeast breads. So the techniques for making yeast breads are pretty simple, but there are a few little secrets that might help you get some better results than you might otherwise get. So the first thing I want to talk about is, what do you do if you forget the yeast? Everyone's done it. Every single person has forgotten to put yeast in. If that happens to you, it's not the end of the world. You do not have to throw out your dough and start over. What you can do is you can dissolve your yeast in a little bit of either water, milk, make sure it's warm. So a little bit of your warm liquid, maybe a teaspoon of yeast dissolving in 2 or 3 tablespoons of liquid, and then work that into the dough after the yeast has dissolved. So that is savable. You can fix that. If your dough doesn't rise, you might want to consider that your yeast might be too old, so test your yeast. We talked about that in another video. Test your yeast. The liquid may have been too hot or too cold. That you can just solve by starting over, basically, because you might have killed your yeast. Or you might have added too much salt. Before you decide any of those things actually happened and you have to start again, place the dough in a warmer spot or wait longer to give it more time to rise. Sometimes your dough needs double the amount of time to rise. If your dough rises too quickly, punch it down, squeeze all the air out, and let it rise again. If it's still rising too fast, move the dough to a colder spot, maybe even your fridge, to slow down the rising. That means your yeast is just really, really active. So if you need to slow it down, move it to a cooler location, such as your fridge if you have to. Pans. Okay, you're going to hear some people tell you that when it comes to your pans, you need to use only aluminum pans. They're wrong, okay? I've heard people say only aluminum pans give you a nice brown crust, but that is not true. So I used a glass pan on this loaf here, and it's actually still quite hot, so I'm just going to handle it with gloves. But you can see it's got perfectly fine browning, okay? It's a glass pan. There's a reason I used a glass pan, so you could see. But it's got perfectly fine browning, no problem. You can use aluminum pans, of course, absolutely. You can also use a non-stick metal pan, or you can use a silicone pan, or you can use a glass pan. It doesn't actually matter. Now, the only thing you want to know is, with a silicone pan, you might want to make sure that you have these wings to help your loaf have some stability. If you don't have these wings, you can end up with a dough that pushes out. This one can't do that because of these wings on the side. That's the only tip I have for pans. Otherwise, use whatever kind of pan you like. I prefer silicone. You might love glass pans. You can use whatever pan you want. Grease the pan as directed in the recipe. So if it tells you to only grease the bottom, then you only grease the bottom. But other than that, you're fine. You can also make dough a day ahead. So if you want fresh bread tomorrow, but you know tomorrow you're not going to have time, then you can just make your dough and then stick it in the fridge to rise for 24 hours. So you make your dough, you put it in your pan to rise, and then you let it rise in the fridge, because the fridge will slow the rising. So you should be able to wait 12 to 24 hours before you bake it. Your dough will also have a much richer flavor if you allow it, because it just lets it ferment a little while longer. So that really can help you have a beautifully tasting loaf. So if you want different kinds of crust, like this crust is an egg wash. So an egg washed crust gives you a shiny crust. It also allows things to stick. So I did oats on this one. So the egg wash gave the oats something to stick to, but where there are no oats, it's actually a pretty shiny crust. So egg wash, either egg white or a whole egg, it doesn't matter, will give you a shiny crust. If you want a crisp crust, brush it with water before baking. If you want a nice hard crust like a French bread or a ciabatta, you might want to take a cake pan, just a regular cake pan, and put either water or ice cubes in it. That increases the humidity in the oven, giving you a nice crisp hard crust. That's only for certain types of bread, but it is really effective. If you want a soft crust, so like a sandwich bread, either brush your loaf with milk before you bake it, or right after you bake it, brush it with melted butter. I like the melted butter method. It's delicious, but you can also just brush it with milk before it goes in the oven. No big deal. So, depending on the bread, most of the time you want to take it out of the pan before you're baking it. This one has to sit 10 minutes in the pan before I remove it, or it'll collapse. But most of the time, if the recipe doesn't say, Turn your bread out immediately. It'll help it keep from getting soggy. Then you want to cool it on a wire rack. That allows air circulation. Make sure that your bread doesn't get all gooey. You also want to cool your bread away from drafts. If there's a draft where your bread is cooling, that can cause shrinkage and cracking, so make sure it's draft free. You want to cool your breads completely before slicing them if possible. If you slice a loaf too warm, it can cause crumbling, tearing, or even cause the center of your bread to kind of go gooey because there's still too much heat in there. Releasing the heat that fast, that's not good. When you're slicing your bread, you want to use a bread knife. This is a bread knife. Don't try to use a regular knife. Use a bread knife. I actually prefer using my electric knife because it makes a really short work of really loaves. It's just good. But bread knife or electric knife, okay? Bread knife or electric knife. And when you cut them, back and forth. Don't press down. If you press down, you're going to squish your bread. Let the knife do the work and just go back and forth, nice and slow. Put that away. Kneading. If your dough is heavy, dry, and crumbly, you didn't knead it enough. Knead a little more next time, a couple more minutes. If your dough is dry and coarse, you might have added too much flour. If your dough is really dry, but it doesn't feel dry when you're handling the dough, but it's dry after you bake it, you probably kneaded it too long. Another tip with your liquids and your flour. Work your flour in slowly. So yes, most breads are a 3-to-1 ratio, 1 part water, 3 parts flour. That changes a little day to day. So be prepared to work a little extra flour or a little extra water into your dough. Just make sure your dough is perfect. So have extra flour and extra water sitting at the side as you're kneading, so you can add extra flour, extra water. For water, add it only a tablespoon at a time. For flour, add it 1/8 of a cup at a time. Otherwise, you'll end up in this never-ending cycle of now it's too wet, now it's too dry. Go slow. While your dough is resting, so while it's rising, prepare your pans. That's a great time to prep your pans because you don't want to do it too early, but you also don't want to suddenly have to prep your pans because you forgot. So after you set your dough for its second rise, wait and prep your pans. Those are the 2 things you can do. Wait for it to rise, prep your pans. Shape, when you're putting bread into a pan or any kind of pan, loaf pan, cake pan, doesn't matter, try to make it so that your rolls or your buns will fill out the pan. You don't want to put tiny little rolls in the bottom of this. You want them to be able to fill out the pan. Use the pan to give your dough structure. Okay? That will help because a lot of doughs don't have a ton of structure. This particular loaf, if I were to bake it without a pan, it just kind of goos all over the pan. So you want to give structure. That's why we cook in pans. You want to give structure to your dough. While you're baking your loaf, if you notice the top is getting too brown, what you want to do is put foil over top, but allow it to continue to bake. Putting foil over top will protect it from getting too brown, but will allow the baking to continue. You don't want to take your dough out, your loaf out, simply because you think it's done just because it's getting too dark on top. Your bread is not done in 15 minutes. Okay. So if your tops are getting too brown, cover them, but continue to allow the entire bake cycle just so that you know that your dough is completely cooked. Finally, when is your bread done? Okay, so your bread and your rolls are done when they're golden brown, like that. They pull away from the sides of the pan. So if you look, and I'm going to put mitts on because it's still very hot. So if you look, if you can see down the corners of the pan, it's pulled away. It no longer fills out that part of the pan. They pull in, so your dough contracts in. So that also is an indicator that your loaf is done. But the other thing that you want to listen for is actually tapping. So you tap on the crust, and it sounds hollow. Do that as soon as it comes out of the oven. If you wait too long, the crust softens a bit, and so it won't make the same sound, but it sounds hollow when I tap it. So when you take them out of the oven, give them a tap. If they sound hollow, they're done. That is about all the tips I have right now. I might come back with another video talking about storing your breads, and I'm definitely going to do one on different types of flour you use in your breads, just to clear up some confusion. But that is all for my basic tips for baking bread. We will come back later and talk about how to make this toasted oat bread that I have here before you. See you tomorrow.